Rich bully mocks the wrong, simple woman. His laughter cuts through the restaurant like a knife. Her eyes meet his. Mock me again? Her voice soft, but deadly. He has no idea what's coming. In seconds, he'll instantly regret every word. The Sterling Room wasn't just a restaurant. It was Manhattan's temple of prestige. Crystal chandeliers suspended from coffered ceilings cast a warm glow over tables, where deals were brokered and reputations forged. White orchids graced each table, their delicate petals mirroring the fragile egos that dined beneath them. To enter these hallowed halls was to announce one's arrival in New York's social pantheon. Margaret Walker pushed through the heavy glass doors, immediately drawing curious glances. Her simple black dress, chosen for comfort during her grueling 20-hour flight from Singapore, hung slightly loose on her slender frame. The wrinkles told stories of airport terminals and cramped economy seats. Her chestnut hair, normally styled with precision, had rebelled during the flight, escaping its hasty ponytail in wisps that framed her exhausted face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, a testament to back-to-back meetings, followed by the international dateline's disorienting jump. She hadn't even stopped at her hotel, coming straight from JFK with her small carry-on, which she now discreetly tucked beside the host stand. Margaret had prioritized punctuality over appearance, a choice the Sterling Room rarely witnessed. "I believe Antonio is expecting me," she said quietly to the host, who studied her with barely concealed skepticism. At the center table sat Richard Harrington, a hedge fund manager whose reputation preceded him in Manhattan's upper circles. His Savile Row suit fit like armor, his Swiss watch catching the light with each deliberate gesture. His companions, similarly tailored and coiffed, hung on his every word. Richard was one of those men who measured their worth by how effectively they could diminish others. His specialty was the casual cruelty delivered with just enough wit that bystanders felt permitted to laugh along. He collected these moments like trophies: the stammering waiter, the flustered shop girl, the tourist who dared ask him for directions. It wasn't about followers or fame. It was simpler and more primal, the rush of power that came from public dominance. Richard's attention shifted as Margaret was led to a table. His predatory gaze registered her rumpled appearance, her obvious fatigue, her simple attire. A slow smile spread across his face, the same smile that had preceded countless humiliations. "Well, well," he murmured to his companions, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Looks like someone got lost on the way to the diner down the street." His companions snickered on cue, their laughter drawing more attention to Margaret. She noticed, of course, but unlike Richard's usual targets, Margaret didn't shrink. Instead, she met his gaze directly, her exhausted eyes suddenly sharp and assessing. The hunt had begun, but this time, the prey was watching the hunter. Margaret opened her menu, her fingers still stiff from the airplane's recycled air. The Sterling Room's signature lighting, designed to flatter the complexions of its wealthy patrons, cast a soft glow across the pristine tablecloth. She could feel Richard's gaze boring into her, cataloging each perceived flaw: the faint coffee stain on her sleeve, her travel-worn shoes, the absence of designer accessories that served as the Sterling Room's unofficial entry fee. A waiter approached, his practiced smile wavering slightly when he saw her. He was young, perhaps mid-20s, with the careful posture of someone who had learned that perfect service was his only armor in rooms filled with power. "Perhaps Madam would prefer our prefix option," he suggested, pointedly avoiding mention of the chef's tasting menu, the most expensive offering. His eyes darted briefly toward Richard's table, as if seeking approval for handling this unexpected situation. "The full tasting menu, please," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that momentarily confused the waiter. "And sparkling water for now. I'll decide on wine after speaking with Antonio." The mention of the owner's name caused the slightest flicker of uncertainty in the waiter's eyes, but he nodded professionally and withdrew. Richard's laugh cut through the ambient conversation like a blade. "Better check your credit limit first, honey. That menu costs more than your entire outfit." Several diners turned to watch the unfolding spectacle. This was the Sterling Room's unspoken entertainment, the occasional public takedown that reminded everyone of the social hierarchy's rigid boundaries. A ritual of reinforcement, where those inside the circle demonstrated why others should remain outside. Margaret took a slow sip of water, her eyes never leaving Richard's. "I'm sure I'll manage." Her calm response only fueled Richard's determination. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with theatrical disdain, a performer who knew his audience well. The slight tilt of his head invited others to join his assessment. "Let me guess, big night out? Once-in-a-lifetime splurge, or just lost?" Each question was a dart designed to pierce dignity. "Tourist bucket list, perhaps? Eat where the real New Yorkers eat?" Margaret placed her napkin in her lap with deliberate care. "Just hungry." The brevity of her response seemed to irritate Richard more than any defense might have. Around them, conversations had quieted, the surrounding tables now passive participants in the unfolding drama. "You know," Richard continued, his voice rising to ensure the surrounding tables could hear, "there's a perfectly decent diner 10 blocks south. Plastic menus, free refills, much more your ambiance." He pronounced the last word with exaggerated precision, as if teaching vocabulary to a child. His companions snickered, emboldened by his cruelty. A woman in diamonds at the next table poorly concealed her smirk behind a manicured hand. An older gentleman frowned slightly but said nothing, his silence a form of complicity that hung in the air. "Thank you for the recommendation," Margaret replied evenly. "Perhaps another time?" The waiter returned with sparkling water, pouring it with a hand that trembled slightly. Richard caught the waiter's eye and winked conspiratorially, a gesture that seemed to say, "We both know she doesn't belong." The young man's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly as he completed his task and withdrew, avoiding Margaret's eyes. His retreat was the withdrawal of a potential ally, another small victory for Richard. Richard stood, sensing an opportunity. He casually strolled toward Margaret's table, wine glass in hand, a predator moving in for the kill. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers seemed to dim. "I'm just trying to save you from embarrassment," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "This place has standards. Doesn't it feel a bit aspirational for someone like you?" The Sterling Room had become a theater, with Richard center stage and Margaret unwillingly cast as his foil. A woman at a nearby table discreetly raised her phone, anticipating a moment worth capturing. "Someone like me?" Margaret echoed, looking directly into his eyes for the first time. Something flickered behind her exhausted gaze, a depth that momentarily gave Richard pause. Not fear, not anger, but something he couldn't quite place. It was gone before he could identify it. Richard faltered momentarily at the unexpected intensity of her gaze, but quickly recovered, glancing around to ensure his audience remained engaged. "Well, let's be honest. You're clearly not from around here." He gestured vaguely at her appearance with his free hand, the diamond cufflink catching the light. "The Sterling Room has a certain clientele, a certain quality we've come to expect." The dining room had grown quieter. Even the waitstaff paused, watching the scene unfold with practiced neutrality that barely masked their discomfort. A sommelier froze mid-pour, wine hovering above crystal. "And you're the arbiter of quality?" Margaret asked, her voice still composed, but with a new edge that made several observers shift uneasily in their seats. The question wasn't defensive. It was almost curious, as if she were studying a specimen. Richard laughed, playing to his audience. "I don't need to be. Quality announces itself, just like..." He gestured at her again. "It's opposite." A few nervous titters scattered through the restaurant, but others were beginning to look uncomfortable, the entertainment value of his cruelty wearing thin. An older couple exchanged glances and subtle headshakes. A young woman with a designer purse looked down at her plate, no longer a willing spectator. "Interesting perspective," Margaret said, folding her hands on the table. Something in her posture had changed, a subtle shift from exhaustion to alertness. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by something cooler, more calculating. Years seemed to fall away from her face, revealing a composed clarity that hadn't been there moments before. Richard, mistaking her composure for weakness, moved closer. The predator closing in, certain of his dominance in this territory he considered his own. "Look, I'm doing you a favor. Places like this eat little strays like you alive. Why don't you..." "Mr. Harrington," Margaret interrupted, her voice now carrying a quiet authority that stopped him mid-sentence. She didn't raise her volume, but somehow her words carried through the restaurant with perfect clarity. Is public humiliation always your opening move, or am I receiving special treatment tonight? The restaurant grew silent, every eye fixed on this unexpected confrontation. The power dynamic, so clear moments ago, suddenly seemed less certain. Richard's smile froze, then faltered. For the first time that evening, doubt crept into his expression. She knew his name. She hadn't been guessing. The Sterling room fell silent, conversations evaporating into the rarefied air. Richard's confident smile hung awkwardly on his face as Margaret's gaze steadied on him. "I make it my business to know the regulars," she said simply, her travel-worn appearance belying the steel in her voice. Richard faltered just a heartbeat before recovering. "Homework or not, you still look like you wandered in from the bus station," his voice carried, designed for his audience. "Standards matter here." Margaret set down her water glass with deliberate precision. The exhaustion in her eyes cleared, revealing something that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Recognition of a predator who had chosen the wrong prey. "Mock me again?" she said, voice barely above a whisper. Those 3 words hung in the air. Not a question, not quite a threat, but a final warning before consequences. Richard laughed, sharp and hollow against the silence. Or what exactly? Margaret's eyes never left his. "Antonio!" she called, her voice suddenly commanding the entire room. Across the restaurant, a distinguished man looked up sharply, recognition and concern flashing across his face as he registered the scene unfolding at her table. Every diner held their breath for what would come next. Antonio's head snapped up at Margaret's voice, recognition instantly flooding his face. "Margaret," he called out, abandoning his conversation mid-word. The distinguished owner moved through his restaurant with purpose, his normally composed demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "Antonio?" Margaret's face softened with warmth as her old friend approached. The exhaustion in her eyes momentarily vanished, replaced by genuine affection. "What is happening here?" Antonio asked, looking between Margaret and Richard with growing understanding. His hand rested protectively on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes to the observing diners. "This gentleman was explaining your restaurant's standards," Margaret said quietly. "Apparently, I don't meet them." Antonio's expression transformed from concern to controlled fury. He turned to Richard, drawing himself up to his full height. "You were speaking of standards to Margaret Walker?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, sensing he'd stumbled into something he didn't understand. "Just a bit of harmless." "There is nothing harmless about disrespect in my establishment," Antonio cut him off, his accent thickening with emotion. "Especially not to the woman who helped my children through college, who taught my Sophia to play the piano, who has sat at my family's Thanksgiving table for 15 years. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the unfolding scene. "Do you have any idea who Margaret Walker is?" Antonio continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Richard swallowed hard. When my wife, Lucia, opened her art gallery, not one bank would give her a loan." Antonio's voice swelled with emotion. "It was Margaret who believed in her dream. Margaret who stood godmother to both my children. Margaret whose simple wisdom guided our family through every challenge." Diners exchanged glances, many leaning forward to catch every word. A woman at a nearby table nodded in quiet understanding. "The woman you mock for her simple dress," Antonio continued, gesturing to Margaret, "built half the schools in her hometown. The woman whose appearance you ridicule has done more good in this world than you will accomplish in 10 lifetimes." Antonio's hand moved to a hidden earpiece. "Security," he said simply. 2 impeccably dressed men appeared as if from nowhere, flanking Richard with silent efficiency. "Mr. Harrington is no longer welcome at the Sterling room," Antonio announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nor at any establishment in my family's network." Richard's face flushed deep red. "You can't—" "I can, and I am," Antonio interrupted. "The Sterling room isn't just a restaurant, Mr. Harrington. It's my family's legacy. And in my family, we know the difference between wealth and worth." He turned to the security team. "Through the kitchen, please. He doesn't deserve to use our front door." As Richard was escorted away, stunned diners watched his humiliating procession through the restaurant. Those who had snickered at his cruelty minutes earlier now avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their complicity. Antonio turned to Margaret, taking her hands in his. "Forgive me," he said softly. "Had I known you were arriving tonight, I would have greeted you properly. Lucia will be furious that she missed you." Margaret smiled. "I came straight from the airport. Didn't want to miss Sophia's recital tomorrow." Around them, the restaurant burst into spontaneous applause, not for wealth or status, but for the authentic connection they witnessed. A reminder that true standards had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with character. Antonio stood, addressing his patrons with renewed dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your evening. And remember, in this establishment, we measure people by the kindness in their hearts, not the labels on their clothes." He turned back to Margaret, his stern expression melting into a warm smile. "Now, shall we call Lucia and the children? They'll want to know you've arrived home safely." 3 days later, Richard Harrington stood in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, staring at his phone in disbelief. The post had gone viral overnight. Shaky footage of his humiliation at the Sterling Room, captured by at least a dozen diners. Their phones had caught everything: his mockery, Margaret's calm dignity, Antonio's thunderous intervention, and Richard's walk of shame through the kitchen. "Das you rich bully" was trending nationwide. His social media accounts hemorrhaged followers by the thousands. Calls from business associates went unanswered. Dinner invitations mysteriously disappeared. The empire of influence he'd built, constructed on the foundation of others' fear, was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The comments were relentless. Finally, someone stood up to him. "Been waiting years to see him get what he deserves. This is the same guy who made my sister cry when she was his waitress." Richard's phone buzzed with a message from his publicist. "Cannot repair this. Strongly advise social media blackout. We'll call tomorrow to discuss exit strategy." Exit strategy. As if he were a failed business venture rather than a human being. Meanwhile, across town in a modest suburban neighborhood, laughter filled the backyard of a charming 2-story home. Children chased each other across lush green grass, while adults gathered around picnic tables laden with homemade dishes. The smell of barbecue filled the warm evening air. Margaret, now rested and relaxed in jeans and a simple blouse, stood beside Antonio at the grill, both holding beers and sharing stories like the old friends they were. "You should have seen his face," Antonio chuckled, flipping burgers with expert precision. 20 years owning the Sterling Room, and I've never enjoyed throwing someone out more." Margaret smiled, watching Antonio's youngest daughter teaching her own children how to play volleyball. "Some lessons need to be learned publicly," she said quietly. "The powerful rarely listen otherwise." "Speaking of power," Antonio said, lowering his voice, "Singapore went well? The water access agreement?" Margaret nodded, taking a sip of her beer. 5 million people will have clean water by next year, worth every minute of that flight. As twilight settled over the backyard gathering, no one mentioned Richard Harrington or the Sterling Room incident. Here, among family and true friends, titles and wealth meant nothing. What mattered was the genuine connection shared over simple food and honest conversation, a richness that Richard, for all his wealth, would never understand. As the sun sets on our story of unexpected triumph, we're reminded that true power isn't found in designer suits or exclusive tables. It's discovered in the quiet dignity of those who know their worth, regardless of how others perceive them. Margaret's journey from being mocked to commanding respect unfolded in just moments, but its impact will last in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. How many times have we judged someone by their appearance, only to discover later the depth of character hidden beneath? Have you ever been underestimated or witnessed someone being dismissed because they didn't fit the expected image? Share your experience in the comments below. Where are you watching from today? Let us know. We're building a community that values substance over superficial judgment. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button to join our growing family of storytellers and listeners who believe in the power of human dignity and unexpected heroes. Remember, in a world quick to judge, sometimes the most profound statement is simply standing your ground and saying, "Mock me again." New stories of triumph, justice, and unexpected heroes arrive every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss the moment when someone like Margaret walks into a room and changes everything. Until next time, this is a reminder that the most powerful people in any room aren't always the ones making the most noise.